Chapter 9 looks at incidents in which children are the homicide offenders. So let's start with a few definitions. So generally when people refer to someone who is a juvenile, we use that to refer to all children under the age of 18. But this is defined differently by statute from one state to another. So some states will either automatically try someone who's committed a certain offense, such as murder, as a juvenile, or they might set the age at which you're considered, try them as an adult, or they might set the age at which you're considered an adult to be at 16 or 17. When we talk about someone who's a teen or an adolescent, we're talking again about someone under 18, but someone who's at least 13. And when we're talking about a preteen or a pre-adolescent, we're talking about someone under the age of 13. So cases of children killing children are not new. In 1874, 14-year-old Jesse Pomeroy mutilated and killed a 10-year-old girl and a 4-year-old boy in 2 separate incidents. In 1968, 11-year-old Mary Flora Bell strangled and killed a 3-year-old boy and a 4-year-old boy. U.S. common law states that children under 7 cannot form mens rea, even though children under the age of 7 have killed. Something we want to think about here is, and the reason we consider them to not be able to form mens rea, is that generally they can't understand the gravity of their actions. So in 1929, 6-year-old Carl Newton-Machen killed his 8-year-old friend Cecil. And this is a case that seems to have involved bullying. Carl ran home and got his father's 12-gauge shotgun and yelled, "I am going to shoot you." The case was heard in criminal court, which means it was heard in adult court, and he spent 15 and was sentenced to 15 years in a juvenile facility, which he did not serve. The case was appealed because juvenile cases were supposed to be heard by a judge and not a jury. The Attorney General of Kentucky allowed him to remain with his parents. So in terms of official data on homicide committed by children, less than 10% of people arrested for murder and non-negligent manslaughter between 2002 and 2004 were under the age of 18. As age increases, the number of arrests for homicide increases. So in that same time period, 3 children under 10 were arrested, 41 between the ages of 10 and 12, and 289 who were 13 and 14. 17-year-olds make up only 4.2% of all those arrested for murder. So here's a question. Are children killing more or less often? The rates of homicide amongst those under 14 are barely perceptible in the numbers, and they hover very close to 0. So when we look at these numbers, it's really hard to see any major differences. Among pre-adolescents, those under 14, homicides began increasing in the late 80s into the early 90s. They peaked in 94 at 0.4 per 100,000. And then for 2000, 2001, 2002, it was 0.1 per 100,000. We do see a rapid increase, though, between ages of 14 and 17. And here we see a rate of 10.5 per 100,000. This peaked in 93 at 31.3 per 100,000. If you recall, that's the time period where we have a lot of gang violence and youth violence. And in 2002, it was down to 9.0 per 100,000. In terms of sex, men far outnumber women as far as juvenile homicide offenders go. Between 80 and 97, 93% of known juvenile homicide offenders were male. But male offenders during this period varied greatly, ranging from over 2,500 in 93 to about 1,500 in 97. The number of female homicide offenders, however, has remained fairly constant, with about 130 cases per year. In terms of race, keep in mind that for every 1 million juveniles in the U.S., 56 were homicide offenders. 56% of known juvenile homicide offenders were black. 30 of every million white juveniles, 34 of every million Native American, and 44 of every million Asian juveniles, and 194 out of every black juveniles were homicide offenders. In terms of who used guns, as far as African Americans go, they used guns in 72% of their offenses. Asians in 67, whites in 59, and Native Americans in 48% of their offenses. Youths are most likely to kill individuals of their own race, and we know that homicide tends to be intraracial. So 90% of whites killed whites, 76% of blacks killed blacks, 58% of Asians killed Asians, and 48% of Native Americans killed Native Americans. In terms of who they killed, the relationship, 16% of whites killed a family member, compared with 17% of Native Americans and 7% of blacks and Asians. And apparently I have blacks in here twice. Looking at juveniles who are homicide offenders in other countries, the number of youth who commit homicides is much higher in the U.S. So in Australia, about 15% of homicide offenders were 19 or younger. In the U.S., during that same time period, 22% were under 20. Problem here is that juvenile homicide is not equally distributed across the U.S. So 88% of counties that actually reported data to the UCR in 1997 had no known juvenile homicide offenders. So most counties don't deal with this as a crime at all. Another 6% had only one known juvenile homicide offender, but a quarter of juvenile homicides were in 8 cities that make up only 12% of the U.S. population: Baltimore, Chicago, Dallas, Detroit, Houston, LA, New York, and Philly. Yay for Boston not being on the list. So essentially, when we think back to some of the theories and some of the other arguments we've heard, large urban populations with all their accompanying problems experience much higher juvenile homicide rates. Who do children tend to kill? So 54% of young male offenders killed acquaintances, compared with 46% of female offenders. 34% of male victims were strangers, whereas 15% of female victims were strangers. 9% of victims were killed by a male offender were family. 39% of victims killed by female offenders were family. So it's kind of an interesting difference there. Young girls are far more likely to kill their own infants than young boys. 18% of female juvenile homicide offenders killed someone under the age of 1, compared with only 1% of male. So each sex, however, kills approximately 25 infants per year. And here we just have a nice little chart that has a breakdown of homicide by age. So parricide then refers to the killing of a close relative, and it's generally used to refer to the killing of a parent, whereas patricide is specifically the killing of a father, and matricide is specifically the killing of a mother. So Eric and Lyle Benendez killed their parents, claiming they'd been abused for years. Their initial trial resulted in a mistrial, and the second trial resulted in them both serving life in prison. Hyde suggests there's 3 types of children who kill their parents. One being severely abused children who feel trapped, a second being mentally ill children, and a third being kids who come from troubled family histories. A parricide offender is typically white upper middle or middle class without a juvenile record. They tend to be between 16 and 18 and are more likely to kill their fathers. Many were good students who were believed to be close to their parents, and they often kill in a very violent attack. The rage is reflected there in the excess number of wounds. They also tend to strike out when the parent is not attacking the children. In the 90s, we know a lot of the youth homicide at that period is revolving around gang activity. And in 1995, Klein published a study where he found that gang homicides were more likely to occur in streets, involve guns, cars, and unidentified assailants. So if we think about that, we're talking about drive-bys. They were more likely to involve injuries to others than the victim, and fear of retaliation is also common. So a lot of times with the drive-by shooting, sometimes an innocent bystander is shot. Offenders were more likely to be male and Hispanic, and they tended to be younger. There have been considerable decreases in the U.S. murder rate, and that's often attributed to those changes in the crack cocaine market and the reduction of gang wars over territory. This should sound familiar to you guys because this is something that, is really a big cause of the uptick in crime in the late 80s, early 90s. Goldstein argued that there's probably 3 relationships between drugs and violence. Some drugs do have psychopharmacological effects that cause someone to become violent. People also commit crimes in order to pay for drugs, and then there's the violence related to the business of selling and trafficking in drugs. The third connection, the business-related violence, is what is generally believed to be the driving force behind much of that youth homicide. So how do children kill? What types of weapons do they use? Male juvenile offenders are more likely to kill with firearms. It's about 3/4 of male offenders and 41% of female offenders. Boys use knives about 14% of the time, whereas girls use knives about 32%. 27% of females used other methods. This is drowning, strangling, or beating. Data from 1980 to 1997 tells us that the number of juveniles who had a co-offender increased with age. So as we get older, you're more likely, as you can see from these percentages, to kill with somebody else. Older juveniles are more likely to kill with an adult, and younger offenders killed with other young offenders. As far as employing an accomplice, girls were much more likely to employ an accomplice in order to kill her family members. So why do children kill? In 1987, Nathan Ferris responded to teasing by shooting a fellow student with his father's gun. And then Ferris turned around and shot and killed himself. So the 90s posed some new questions for us about teen murderers. They're not killing for profit. They're not killing out of passion. We see at this time period a lot of mostly white suburbanite teens from good middle-class families planning massacres with the intent of killing their classmates and teachers. Research, however, does tell us that people do not kill out of the blue. Most have been exposed to violent and abusive environments, and many have displayed aggression in the past. It's difficult to determine then what factors lead children to kill. Some may suffer from psychological disorders. Some may suffer from psychosis. One thing that kind of gets in the way of studying this is a lot of studies use convenience samples that are obtained by psychologists and psychiatrists. Most of what we do know has learned from studying children who were assigned some type of treatment. We do know amongst those kids that abuse is not uncommon, and many have prior records, as do their parents. They're often gang affiliated, and educational problems and alcohol abuse are often common. So some feel that early factors in the child's development play a role. What did the mother ingest while pregnant? Did she have any nutritional deficiencies? Ineffective discipline? Newman examined cultural and social structure of schools in relation to school massacres, and here we see some things related to media violence, bullying, and demographic changes. And she proposed that 5 things are necessary for a school massacre. First, the young shooters have to perceive themselves as marginalized, and they have to be experiencing psychosocial problems that make that marginalization more extreme than it really is in reality. A cultural script of masculinity in our society suggests that shooting people will gain them the respect they desire. The way public schools in the U.S. are organized makes it difficult for us to recognize warning signs. And then even when peers do recognize them, they often do not report them to adults. And finally, as is the case with most violence in the U.S., we have an ease of accessibility of guns. So what happens to children who kill? In 1889, the juvenile court develops. It develops in Cook County, Illinois, which is where Chicago is. And basically here we're looking at juveniles in a different way. We see them as different from adults, and we believe at the time it's best not to label children as criminals, but rather to intervene in their lives and set them back on the right path. As we see conservatism grow in the U.S., violent juvenile crime increase, we start enacting laws to treat them as adults. The Juvenile Offender Act of 1978 allowed juveniles as young as 13 to be tried in adult courts. The law for this is named after Willie Bosket, who killed another young man in a fight and then shot and killed 2 additional men on the subway in New York. And he was quoted as saying he wanted to see what it was like to kill another human being. And by 1999, all juveniles could be tried. Juveniles could be tried as adults in all states. Between 92 and 97, 44 states added or amended their transfer provisions. Transfer provisions are what allow us to try a juvenile offender as an adult. And there's 3 main methods for this. In a prosecutorial waiver, what happens is the prosecutor just decides whether or not to file in juvenile court or adult court. Statutory waivers, the law dictates under certain circumstances that someone is automatically tried as an adult. Judicial waivers, however, are cases where the judge decides whether to hear the case in juvenile or adult court. Usually here we're looking at a serious charge, and the juvenile still has to meet a minimum age requirement. The burden in this hearing, though, is not beyond a reasonable doubt. It's a preponderance of the evidence. And the judge is supposed to determine what is in the best interest of not only the youth, but also the public. So this may actually require a judge to explain why he chose not to transfer the case to adult court. Lionel Tate was 12 years old when he killed Tiffany Unick, who was 6 at the time. And this is a case that you may have heard of. He was imitating some wrestling moves, and he was tried as an adult and found guilty. In 2004, his case was overturned in appeals court. They had determined that he didn't have the capacity to understand the charges against him. In turn, he pled guilty to second-degree murder and was sentenced to the time he had already served plus 1 year house arrest. By the age of 19, he returned to prison for 10 to 30 years for a parole violation when he robbed a pizza delivery boy with possession of a gun. A 7-year-old Florida boy beat his 7-month-old half-sister to death with his hands, feet, and a piece of lumber. Florida at the time had no age barrier for homicides, and the authorities really struggled to determine whether or not he had the capacity to form criminal intent. And that wraps up the chapter on children who kill.